Rob Hopkins, everybody. If you are there, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. How very lovely to see you all on this very gorgeous day. It is here anyway. Hello. Yeah, I'm Rob, and I think you are mine for about the next 2 hours. So we're going to have some time for questions and conversation, and also and I'm going to talk as well. And I'm going to kind of take you through some of the ideas that are fundamental to the transition movement and some of the thinking that really underpins the book that I just wrote all about imagination, as Pontus said. And I'm going to do a share my screen thing so that I can, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that as well. And then hopefully you can still see me while I just do that. And it all looks highly professional and almost like I know what I'm doing. So, yes, so I'm going to talk to you about imagination, because as you probably are aware at this point in your studies, we're in real trouble, and we have a huge amount to do, and the window in which we can do that is tiny. And so I feel like if we are to do all the things that we need to do in order for life on this planet to survive, then the next 10 years will need to feel like a revolution of the imagination, like living through a revolution of the imagination. And I'm going to go on to explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to give you an overview of some of the key ideas that are in the book. So to begin, I think it's really important to start where Extinction Rebellion movement always start their talks, which is what they call tell the truth. So it's really important that we do that. I like to think of where we are now as humanity as being as if we're standing on top of a mountain. And during the last 150 years, we have dedicated all of our effort and energy and brilliance and imagination, if you like, to climbing up this mountain. And now we stand on the top of this mountain, and beneath our feet is more plastic, more carbon, more anxiety, more stress, more inequality, more loneliness, more carbon than we've ever stood on top of before. And when you look at it like that, but then we're standing on top of the mountain, and some of us, absolutely not all of us, have spectacular views from the top of this mountain. Some people. The guides who are at our side, who know this mountain really well, are saying to us, we really need to get down off this mountain really, really quickly. Can you see the storm clouds that are coming in? We absolutely need to get down off this mountain really, really fast. You know, we know from the climate scientists that we need to get down to zero emissions within the next 10, 15 years. That's huge. That's never been done before. Anything on that kind of scale. It's kind of, which is why the fact that it's such a huge task means for some people it's just completely unimaginable, and we shut down the possibility that that could ever be the case. But actually, so when we're at the top of this mountain, so for some of us that works, having these guides who tell us that that's what we need to do. But it doesn't work for everybody. It's not working for everybody. And I wonder whether a better approach might be instead to tell the stories about the lower slopes of this mountain, to tell the stories about the valleys, about the warm welcome that awaits us there, the warm firesides, the delicious food, the amazing wine, the dry socks and really comfortable beds that await us when we get there. You know, if we can talk about and bring alive in people's imaginations the realities of living in a very low carbon future in a way that is so delicious and so enticing, then we create longing. And I feel like our key work in 2021 is how do we cultivate longing for a low carbon future? And that is not done with facts and figures and things like that. It's done with storytelling. It's done with imagination. The work of creating longing is something that we usually leave to our novelists, our playwrights, our musicians. You know, we need, it's about that idea of, as I say, cultivating that deep longing in humanity, because the human imagination is a really, really extraordinary thing. Human imagination, which my favorite definition of it is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. If there was ever a superpower we needed in 2021, it is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise, because we are surrounded by organizations and government departments with huge power to shape the future, who are unable to imagine anything other than things carrying on as they always have been. Do we have a defense department who are dreaming of ways to make the world a peaceful place? No, we have a militaries who just imagine that there will always be war forever and ever and ever. Do we have health services that really imagine we're going to get to a place where people are really, really healthy? Do we really have transport departments who are actively dreaming of a world without cars? Unless you are able to dream about it and create that space, it's never going to happen. You cannot build what you cannot imagine. So the imagination is fundamentally important to this struggle. This is Walida Amarisha, who I love, who's a writer. She does a lot of telling stories about the future. And this is a quote from her, which I love. She said, "Whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction." I love that. All organizing is science fiction. That will come back to you over the next few days. What did she mean? All organizing is science fiction. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. Many of those phenomenal movements, like the prison abolition movement in the United States, that have kept going for 50, 60, 70 years, holding these really big what if questions, like what if we had no prisons? What if we had no police? Are so important. And there's so much that we can learn from those movements. This is a book that you all probably remember from your childhood. And indeed, some of you may be reading it to your own children as you speak. This is Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss. This book came about because Dr. Seuss was challenged by his publisher to write a book that just used 50 words. That was his palette to write a book from. And it took him 2 years. And he always said it was the most challenging writing experience he ever did, and it was the best exercise his imagination ever had. Because one of the things that's most fascinating about imagination is that it thrives when it has limits. When you put limits around your imagination, if I said, Pontus, tell us a story, where do you start? If I said, Pontus, tell me a story about a mouse that lives under the piano behind you, who has a little blue hat and who only plays his piano on Thursdays, then you've got something to work with. Then you've got some limits around the story in which you can flourish. It's why when you study improvisation, you get given these scenarios within which you can create. So the beauty of the climate and ecological emergency that we're in is that it imposes limits. And I travel around Europe and I meet people doing transition in so many different places. And it's those places where people really recognize the challenges, where you see the imaginative ideas. The people who imagine that there are no limits and we can just carry on as ever are by far the least imaginative people that you're ever going to meet. But we have a problem with the imagination, which is that our collective imagination is in trouble. I started writing this book because I kept reading people who I really love and admire, like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and people like that, who were saying climate change is a failure of the imagination. Climate change is a failure of the imagination. Something about those words kind of got under my skin. I kept reading them in different places. People were saying climate change is a failure of the imagination. I was thinking, well, why? Why is that the case? Why would it be that in 2021 we're having a failure of the imagination? And then I came across this research that was published in 2010 by a researcher from the US called Kyung-hee Kim. She looked at a massive data set of research going back to the 1960s that looked at people's creativity, people's ability to sort of come up with alternative uses for different objects and things like this. And her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together till the mid-90s, and then IQ kept rising and imagination started to decline and has been declining ever since. And when this was published, it made the front page of Newsweek magazine. It was a really big story. People thought, oh, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood and Pixar? I mean, I don't really care about either of those things very much, I have to say. what I care about is, what does this mean for the movements who are trying to save humanity? What does this mean for the movements who are trying to save the planet and social justice and things like this? Because again, if we can't imagine it, you cannot build what you cannot imagine. So if we have an imagination crisis, we're in trouble. So when she was in her paper, she reflected on why this might be. And she said that it was because of a decline in play, it was due to the rise of screens, and it was due to the rise of testing in schools. And I think she's right on all of those things, but there are other things which I will go on. So if we are thinking about how do we cultivate longing, how do we, in the conversations, in the work we do, in the people that we meet, in the work we do around the climate, around climate change, how do we cultivate longing in people for a different future? One way, I think, is through arts and visual images. This is an amazing artist called James Mackay, who works at the University of Leeds, who I always call the man who draws the future. He's a graphic novelist who brings future and science to life. And this is his drawing of the city where he lives if it became the most biodiverse city in the world. What if we started now to say the city where you lived, in 10 years, it's going to be as biodiverse as it could possibly be. And between now and then, we're going to do absolutely everything we possibly could do to make that the case. What could it be like? Where might we get to? Well, maybe we might get to here. And when you look at this picture, you can almost imagine what it would sound like, what it would smell like in that future. It really helps to kind of bring it to life. This is another of his pictures where he says, okay, we're already seeing, as we emerge from COVID, many cities now saying, look, we've given far too much space to the car. We've given far too much space to pollution and losing all of that public realm. If we take the cars out, what might we do instead? Well, maybe it might look like this. So the city where you live, if it decided, if the longing was strong enough, we could do this in 5 years' time. Now, if you think about the moon landings, when Neil Armstrong went to the moon, that wasn't his idea. That wasn't JFK's idea in 1960. We'd been going to the moon for decades before then, in songs and stories and films. Tintin went to the moon, Frank Sinatra sang us to the moon, and Mickey Mouse probably went to the moon. Everybody went to the moon by the time JFK said, let's go to the moon, because the longing had been created. So we get the longing right, and then we can do things. I'm always looking for ways that people use to bring this kind of transition alive for people. So this is a film, a little clip made by some colleagues of mine in London, in an amazing project I'll talk about a bit later. This is Fleet Street in London as it looks today. Okay, it looks kind of permanent, doesn't it? It's always going to look like this. It's really hard to imagine this as anything other than how it is now, right? Okay, well, maybe we could imagine it like this. Kind of becomes a bit easier, doesn't it? You can now walk down a street with your kind of possibilities glasses on, and you can look at the street that you walk home to after this talk. Although saying that you're probably all at home because of COVID. Anyway, when you go out this evening and you walk down a street you know really well, try and do this exercise in your head. Try and run it. Try and run through it and say, okay, how might it be if we completely reimagined how this space works? You know, this could be the same. This could be, again, could be the same anywhere. And how much more exquisite would our lives be if we lived in such a setting? And this is not just some kind of Rob mad fantasy. This is already starting to happen in some places. This is in Barcelona, where the municipality are closing 30% of all the streets in the center of the city, and they're turning those streets into forests, places for community, places for play, places for creativity. Absolutely beautiful. This is now, particularly as we emerge from COVID and we realize that air pollution makes people much more susceptible to COVID, when we realize that as the climate warms, we need space, we need shelter from trees, also how good trees are for our mental health. This is a completely logical way to be reimagining our cities. And I'm going to share two little film clips with you, which are films that I've just been making recently. So I do a podcast called From What If to What Next. And every episode is framed around a different what if question. What if we had universal basic income? What if birdsong drowned out the traffic? What if we decolonized our education system? These kind of things. And every episode has two people. And at the beginning, I ask them to close their eyes and to imagine they're in 2030, and that the what if question we're discussing has happened, has become a reality. Walk us through that world, describe it to us, bring it alive for us, like in that animation. And it's often the most powerful part of the whole thing. And then I've cut out some of my favorite little clips of people talking. And then over the last couple of months, I worked with an animator, with two animators, and they made these. So I'm going to show you one, and then I'm going to show you a second. So this is our little taking you on a little journey to a 2030 that's not utopia, but it's the result of everything that could possibly have been done being done.
We're going to be using re in our language. We're going to be rebuilding, refurbishing, remaking, reusing, recreating, reinventing. The re is going to be a big part of our language.
Police and prisons and the armed forces were massively defunded, and that money has gone into robust preventative health care and well-being programs that also contribute to a rich imagination.
Financial insecurity has been eradicated. People no longer go to work because they have no choice.
And so all these workspaces that used to be occupied by big banks are now, of course, being redirected and used for creative spaces of all sorts, whether it's technical or artistry.
If you see girlfriends meet each other, they won't say, oh, you got this new dress, but they will say, oh, you got the same dress that you wore last week, but now you've made a little change about it. And that's so fancy and that's so fashionable.
Okay, so that's the first one. This is hopefully the second one.
The city really changed since the Ministry of Imagination was born. The city has become a huge laboratory in which everyone can participate.
You can hear laughter, not just the laughter of children, but the laughter of adults.
The place is alive with activity. There's people everywhere doing things.
People can walk freely in their bodies, regardless of their shape, their size, their abilities, their gender expressions, the color of their skin, their age, and there's an embrace of that.
We care about the things that we have. We cherish them, we repair them, we make sure that they will last for a very long time.
Faces are beautifully lined, full of the marks of laughter and a life well lived. It smells like growing things.
Well, I hope you enjoyed those. Before I go on to the next bit, I'm just going to stop because when I go on share screen, I can't actually see anybody at all. So firstly, I just want to check that you were all still here, because I did do a talk to a university recently where I started speaking and something went wrong and I ended up speaking to myself. I realized everybody had gone. But just to see if anybody has any kind of pressing questions or things that you're wondering about at this stage before I carry on, anything that's not clear or anything that you'd like to ask before I carry on. Are these videos available somewhere to share? The first one is available on the blog that I do, which is robhopkins.net. The second one will be being posted next week. And then the third one, there are three altogether. The third one, which isn't quite finished, will be coming out shortly after that. Okay, so everybody's all right. We're all good. Okay, I will continue then. Right, so I'm going to frame what I'm going to be doing with you around 9 what if questions. And which are the chapters of the book, and the sort of first one of those is what if play was at the heart of the everyday. So as I said, the author who wrote that paper, The Creativity Crisis, She said that play, the decline of play, was one of the reasons why we're seeing a decline in imagination. So when I was a kid, without wishing to sound too kind of old, there was a whole culture of kids playing outdoors. I love this picture of this little girl going out to play in her dad's boots, in her dad's shoes, and visions of him getting up to go to work in the morning and finding his shoes had disappeared. But children had a whole culture of games and places and songs and activities that adults knew absolutely nothing about. And it was, when kids can play like this, it's how kids learn to cooperate. It's how kids learn to manage conflict. It's how kids learn to take risks. And that kind of free play, not structured play, that kind of let's pretend and that kind of what if play culture is absolutely fundamentally important to the mental well-being of kids as they grow up. And we've lost this so much, has disappeared from our streets. So when I was researching the book, I really wanted to try and find somewhere where they were actively trying to bring play back again. And I found an organization based in Bristol in the southwest called Playing Out. And what Playing Out do is they make it really easy for communities to close their streets for play. And they've negotiated ways with the local authority that make it really, really easy. So I went to this street in Bristol on a Wednesday evening in the summer, and the street was closed at both ends. And there were a couple of parents in kind of high-vis jackets, and the street was just full of children playing and drawing with chalk on the pavement and making up games and running around and skipping. And I spoke to one of the mothers who said to me, this is just what happened. This is just what happens when you get the cars out of the way. It's not like play and imagination have disappeared, but they've just lost their space. It's been driven out. And when it's too dangerous, there's nowhere for it to appear. I spoke to one of the fathers in the street who said, well, after about 6 months of doing this, we started to realize that we quite liked each other as neighbors. So he started to get a sense of that moment in time when all the children started going indoors because outside was too dangerous because of the cars, was also the kind of the time when communities really started to fragment, because it was the children all playing together that gave the adults a reason to connect with each other. And we've lost so much by losing these intentional spaces for play. So in my town, in Totnes, where I live in the southwest of England, we did a festival a few years ago that was a festival of street games. We closed the square at the top of the town, and we invited people to come and to bring their children. And we had some people who were displaced people who had moved to the town, who were able to share some of the street games from where they live, from where they come from. And the first half of the day, the street, the square filled up with children playing and the adults standing around saying, isn't this great to see our children playing? And then in the second half, the adults realized they could play too. And then it was just complete chaos. But there was something beautiful about seeing that and about making a space for that. This was one of my favorite games that I learned that day, which I'd not seen before, which is a Dutch game called Spekerpuppen, where you get a piece of string and you tie a nail on it, and you tie it to the back of your trousers or the back of your skirt, and then looking backwards between your legs, you have to try to get the nail into the neck of a bottle. And it's fantastic. This little girl was playing that game for about 10 minutes. If you're ever worried about your attention span or your children's attention span, this is a phenomenal thing to do. Maybe next time you're all together back at university and you're all able to be in the same room with each other, maybe you might have a round of this game. It's really good fun. But increasingly, play is something that we buy for our children. It's something that they consume, not something that they do. And modern toys increasingly they don't offer so much space for the imagination. If you have a pile of sticks and some leaves and a cardboard box, you can turn that into anything. It could be a starship, it could be a house, it could be a monster. Like Barbie doll can only ever really be a Barbie doll. So many toys these days do one thing and don't allow you any capacity to imagine it as something different. So if that ability to play, to think in a playful way is so useful for children, maybe it's good for us as adults too. We don't really play very much in a kind of what if, let's pretend kind of a way. And what might it be like if we were able to bring that kind of let's pretend activism into our that sort of let's pretend play into our activism, is what I'm trying to say. So this is an exercise that was developed in the transition movement, working with an organization called Encounters Arts, and it's called Transition Town Anywhere, or sometimes it's called Pop-Up 2030. And it's an exercise where you start with 100 people to 400 people, something like that, and you need a big space. And you begin by doing a bit like in those videos I showed you. You begin by imagining that you're traveling forwards to 2030 and you're arriving in a 2030 that's not utopia, but that it's the result of us doing everything we possibly can during that time. It was a phenomenal period of time, really quite extraordinary. And you arrive in that time and then you think, what am I doing in this future? What's my role in this future? What work am I doing? What do I run a business? What am I doing? And then you meet other people who are interested in similar things. And then together you then build that world out of cardboard and bamboo and string and sticky tape and pens. You create and you live in and you trade in and you celebrate in a different kind of future. It's extraordinary to be with that many adults completely lost in a play world of their imagining is something really, really powerful. This was the last time we did it in October 2019. This might look to you like some chairs and some cardboard boxes. Actually, this is the public transport system for Transition Town Anywhere. And these two young men here could tell you everything about it, what noise it made, where it went, what it smelt like, what color the tickets were, everything about it. For them, this was a fully realized reality, and the same for everything else that everybody had created here. The poet Rilke once said, and this is so beautiful, I'm going to say it twice, said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens." The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. I love that so much. And exercises like this are able to do that. They're able to bring that future alive for us in a way that is really, really kind of deeply transformative. So the first time I did this exercise was in 2012. And I ended up with a group of people where we played that we had created a business, which was a brewery and a bakery and a mill all in the same building. We were like, if any future is worth fighting for, it has buildings with a brewery and a mill and a bakery in the same building. That's just so it was called the Yeast Collective. I can still tell you what some of the beers were called that we had, how we funded it through community crowdfunding, how it ran a training program as well. You know, it was completely realized reality in our imaginations. The next year in my town, we actually started a brewery called the New Lion Brewery. If you're ever in Totnes, you must come and visit. And then last year, we became the UK's first 100% community-owned brewery in order to raise money so that we could move the brewery into the same building as a mill and a bakery. So by the end of this year, we will have a building with a brewery and a mill and a bakery in it. And when we were doing the crowdfunding, people would say, but how do you know that's going to work? And I would say, I know this is going to work because I played it. I have absolutely no doubt this is going to work. I played it and it was extraordinary. So when you bring play into the work that you do, the activism that you do, it makes such a huge difference. So our second what if question is, what if we considered a healthy imagination vital to our health? That might sound like a slightly strange question because sure, you know, imagination we've been led to believe is something kind of a bit of a luxury. It's something that's a kind of, it's a bit silly, a bit cheeky, something children do. It's actually really fundamentally important to our health. And in many ways is actually a manifestation of our health. This is a part of your brain called the hippocampus. It's kind of in the middle, sort of down from there, in from there, sort of around there. and is shaped like the wishing bone of a chicken. It has a right half and a left half, and it's the part of your brain where your imagination fires from. All of the neural networks that form when you're being imaginative have the hippocampus at their center. It's also the part of your brain where your memory is organized from. So when you're being imaginative, what you're doing really is going to the cupboards of your memory and looking through those cupboards and trying to find interesting things. And then it's the moment when you put two different things together and you make something that didn't exist before. That's the imagination piece. So so you're only able to be as imaginative when you are trying to imagine a low carbon future, as you have kind of ideas and things you've seen in your head. If you go to your memory cupboards and there's nothing in there, it's really, really hard to imagine a low carbon sustainable future. You need to have stuff in there. So one of the most powerful and important things you can do right now, and you're doing it by being part of this course, but we can do it in so many ways, is to fill our cupboards with stories, is to find those stories of incredible things that people are doing in different parts of the world, of urban agriculture projects, community energy projects, and so on and so on. Fill your cupboards, because then when you meet problems, you can start to draw things out from those cupboards. The thing that's most important to know about the hippocampus is that it is the part of your brain which is most vulnerable to cortisol, the anxiety hormone. So when we are really anxious, the hippocampus shrinks. People with post-traumatic stress disorder, the hippocampus can be 20% smaller than it would otherwise have been. And often what happens then when our hippocampus shrinks is that we lose that ability to think about the future in positive and hopeful ways, and we get stuck in the present and we get stuck in the past, which feels to me like what's happening to us on kind of on a big scale. You know, as we become more and more anxious as a population, our hippocampus collectively is kind of shrinking. So I was really interested when I started researching the book to try and find a place where they were actively trying to rebuild the hippocampus, to create a kind of a campus for the hippocampus, if you like. I went to Scotland, to Dundee, to visit an amazing project there called Art Angel, run by this fantastic artist called Rosalie Summerton. What they do, this is on a first floor office block in the center of Dundee, and it is people go there who have mental health problems, or anxiety or burnout or trauma or stress or whatever. And they say, when you come here, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition. And every year in Dundee, in the biggest art gallery in the center of Dundee, they put on an exhibition of work from Art Angel. And I went there one day and people knew I was coming and they were really happy to tell me their stories. And I spoke to one woman who said, 6 months ago, even though I have two beautiful children and a partner who I love, I came that close to killing myself. And in the 6 months I've been coming here, I can see the future again. I spoke to one man who worked in local government for 30 years, and then he had a big burnout. And he said, I said to him, so do you think of yourself as an artist? And he paused and he said, yeah, why not? You know, you could see people reimagining themselves. And what they found was that people who had been through the mental health services, whether they had been sectioned or put in psychiatric hospitals in different ways, what people lose in that process is the ability to make decisions. All decisions are completely taken out of your hands. One man I spoke to who had spent a long time on a psychiatric ward said, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody gets a cup of tea with milk and 2 sugars. You know, what are the odds that everybody on that ward takes milk with 2 sugars? You know, you lose the ability to make decisions. So Rosalie told me about how when people arrive, quite often, even just the choice of, do I use a red pencil or a blue pencil to make this line, is a huge decision for people. And art is a really good way to bring people back. And what they do at Art Angel every year in order to continue their funding is they do a survey of their artists. But rather than giving them a long multiple choice questionnaire, what they do is they give them a piece of paper with 2 outlines of a human body. They say, fill the first one in to show how you feel, how you felt before you came here. And the second one to show how you feel now that you've been coming here for some time. And I looked through a big pile of these and it was very moving, very emotional. And here's just one I want to share with you that doesn't need much explanation. I think when I look at this, what it makes me think is firstly, how powerful the work they do at Archangel is. And secondly, this is what the next 10 years need to feel like. If we are successful in creating a very, very low carbon future in the next 10, 15 years, it'll feel like this. This image is kind of what gets me out of bed every morning, that I'm longing for this. I want us to get to a stage where the work that we have done has borne fruit and it looks and it feels like this. So that's 2. So the third one is, what if we followed nature's lead? And what I mean by that is all of the great kind of artists and poets and people who have nurtured and inspired our collective imagination through history have been inspired by nature. They've spent time in nature, they've reflected nature, they've drawn their lyricism, their palette of colors from looking at the world around them. But we spend less and less time out in nature. And during my lifetime, or since the Beatles split up, however you want to look at it, we've lost 70% of the creatures that we share this planet with. 70%. And lost is a pretty misleading word. Kind of exterminated would probably be better. The economic system that we have that will destroy 70% of the life on the planet around it, just as a kind of an unavoidable externality of progress, is ridiculous. And I feel like when we live in a world where that diversity around us, the diversity of the living world around us is contracting so quickly, that our imagination shrinks with it. There was a microbiologist called René Dubos who used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. When you visit a place that is much more alive with biodiversity, your imagination expands with it. And when it shrinks, I think our imagination shrinks with it too. So creating connection to nature and bringing diversity back are going to be fundamentally important, I think, to our collective imagination. In Scotland, there is a doctor's practice on the Shetland Islands, which prescribes people nature connection. If you go to the doctor with depression or obesity or things like that, they will give you a little book with activities to do every month, because they recognize that nature connection is profoundly important to our well-being. So the doctor in May might say, rather than give you some pills, he might say, go and bury your face in the grass. Go and make a daisy chain. Go and turn over a rock and see what's underneath the rock. Sit cross-legged on the ground, close your eyes and listen to the birds. You know, how different would our world be if we saw nature connection as being a vital part of our root, of our connection back to well-being? And the idea that we need to bring nature connection back into our cities is something which is growing really, really, really fast. There are many movements now around the world that are trying to do that. And one of my favorite is in London, and it's called London National Park City. And the idea of London National Park City started with a geographer called Daniel Raven Ellison, who took his son to visit all of the national parks in London. And when he came home, what did I say? No, he went to visit all the national parks in the UK, not in London. And when he came back, he made this map of London. So this is a map of London, but just showing the green spaces and the blue spaces. This is London with no bridges, no roads, no buildings, just green space, just blue space. Gardens included, parks, everything. When he did that, he realized that 49.5% of London was green space and blue space. And he thought, if we could just make another 0.5%, then the majority of London would be green space and blue space. So it could qualify as being a national park. So they started a project called London National Park City, and it was really framed around what if questions. They said, they put posters up all over London saying, what if the rivers in London were so clean that you could swim to work? What if the bird song was louder than the traffic? And so on. And what if there were more trees than people in London? And last July, the Mayor of London declared London a national park city. And for their launch, they didn't do a big launch in a glitzy hotel or something. They invited everybody in London to do their own launch in their back gardens or wherever. And the beautiful thing about that 0.5% to make London a national park city is that that comes down to being 1 square metre for every person in London. So it offers the question, where's your square metre? Is it at home? Is it where you work? Is it your place of worship? Is it your university? There's something about a good what if question, and in this context it unlocked so much creativity and so much possibility in the population of London. What I see in many places actually is this connection back to nature. Is one of my favorite projects that I've ever been to is in Richmond, California, is a project called Urban Tilth, which is working in a very tough neighborhood teaching people how to grow food. And what they found there was that they've been running it for 15 years. They've trained 2 generations now of young people from there to food. And so I went to the organizers and said, have you noticed an increase in imagination in that place? And they all said yes, because actually what's happened is that people are able to, when they spend time really getting immersed in nature, becoming acquainted with the seasons, when we talk to them, they talk about how they now want to stay here and create a life here, and they see much more possibility. So connecting an urban population to its nature, to nature, when we spend less and less time in nature, is really important. I'm going to do this one, this next what if question, and then I'm going to stop. Okay, will I just pick up, Pontus? Is that good?
Yes, welcome back everyone, and just go on, Rob.
Okay, so where were we? So we were in Arles, in our kitchen, and Vincent had just come in with his big bunch of flowers, and he sits down at his little simple table and he arranges these beautiful sunflowers in this little earthenware pot that he has there. And the sunlight comes in through the window and lights up the beautiful yellows and greens of the sunflowers. He sits back in his little simple little chair to look at the sunflowers and lights his pipe. And then he gets out his smartphone and thinks, oh, I'm just going to check my Twitter. And I'm just going to check my Instagram. And I'm just going to check my Facebook and my email. And then 2 hours later, he's watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs, and he can't even remember why he started to look at videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. If that had happened, this wouldn't exist, because these things are absolutely toxic to our imagination and to our attention span. Art is really the ability, is really what emerges from our ability to really bring our attention to something. When you look at a painting like this, what you're looking at is Vincent's absolutely focused attention to that, to the light, to the whole experience of what that is, and that's what he's capturing there. So if he had had that kind of distraction, this wouldn't have existed, and all the delight that this has given to people over many decades wouldn't have existed. And I worry that as we become more and more distracted and less able to concentrate and to sustain our attention on things, firstly, our ability to make great art sort of disappears, but also our ability to live in a culture that has wisdom in it starts to disappear. Because in order to have wisdom in a culture, you need the attention span and the concentration and the focus to dive deep into knowledge. That's where wisdom comes from in a culture. I think increasingly our relationship to knowledge is like we water ski across the surface. because we no longer have the capacity to dive deep. One of the people who I interviewed for the book, a guy called Sven Burkert, incredible, wrote a book called The Gutenberg Elegies, all about what happens in a culture when people stop reading books. He says, I fear that we are losing the very paradigm of depth from our culture. And that's really, really serious. And these devices that we carry around in our pockets are designed to be addictive in a way that many of us are evolutionarily incapable of resisting. They're always calling us. If you sit down, I read Anna Karenina once, for heaven's sake, by Tolstoy when I was in my early 20s. I couldn't do it now. If I sat down to try and do that, page 1 might be all right. Page 2, by page 3, I'd be wondering if there was anything interesting on my Twitter page. By page 4, I'd be wondering if I should just be checking my email. You know, that ability to really sustain yourself with arguments and narrative is really disappearing. And as I said, with this collapse of our attention span, driven by people with who value our attention much, much more than we value our attention, literally, financially, who are trying to, the way I like to think of it is, if you think about the platforms you use every day, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Instagram, what are their wishes for the next 5-10 years of your life? When you sit and think, what do I want to do in my next 5 years? You might think, right, I want to finish my studies at university. I want to go and start this project. I want to travel to this place. You know, in your imagination, you have things that you want to do over your next 5 years. What are those? What do those platforms wish for you for your next 5 years? It's that you give as much of your attention to their platform as possible. Nothing else matters, really. So we're kind of on two conveyor belts moving in different directions. It's like as if we bought a sat-nav for our car and set it to take us to Glasgow, and we ended up in London. We'd say, this sat-nav is rubbish. You know, I want my money back. But every day we start out thinking, I'm going to do this. And then we end up watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs and we can't remember why we got there. Any national debate around imagination and cultivating imagination needs to include a real look at these technologies, because part of it is that we have become terrified of being bored. But boredom is the time when your imagination is calling you. That time when you just sit and stare and look out the window with nothing to do, that's when the great ideas come. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came when he rode his bicycle through the forest. We need to create space. Imagination needs space, and we have to intentionally create that. And that means developing a different relationship with these devices and technologies that are around us. So what if school nurtured young imaginations? Increasingly, one of the things that was interesting in the research that I did was that all the research done around imagination shows that between 3 and 5, there has been no decline in the imagination of kids, going back to when they've done that back to the 1960s. 3 to 5-year-olds are just as imaginative as they always were. Something happens when they hit 5 or 6, and that thing is school. And we have an education system which is ruinous to the imagination, actually, because it's about tests and measuring everything and getting our kids to kind of fit into a particular kind of a model. And one of the things that so for the book, I spoke to people doing really imaginative education projects around cultivating imagination all over the world. And one of the key things that really came out of that was that they all spoke about a school in Italy, in a place called Reggio Emilia. And it's a really interesting story, because in 1945, at the end of the war, the Germans were retreating north, and they retreated away from Reggio Emilia, and they left behind a tank and 3 trucks and 6 horses. And the people in Reggio Emilia sold those things and used the money to build a school based on the philosophy of making sure that fascism never happened again. What a brilliant ethos for a school. The main aim of our school is to make sure that fascism never happens again. And the way they did that was having an approach to education that said that viewed young people as being what they called authors of their own learning. Every school had a workshop like this at its heart, where kids could go at any time of day and someone would help them to make whatever it was they wanted to make. And they didn't teach in subjects, they taught in projects. And it's an incredible, And the building is really important. So it's full of plants, full of life, full of spaces. It's a really incredible model, which has spread to many different places. And in the book, I talk about people who are trying to do imaginative projects within existing schools, people designing whole new schools from scratch, people doing away with the whole idea of school completely and doing a kind of a citywide homeschooling project that sees the city as being the classroom. But one of my favorite ones is in a city near where I live in the southwest of England, in a city called Plymouth. In Plymouth, there's an art school, a really good art school, and they take people from 16 to study art. And they noticed after a while that a lot of young people were coming there, and after a couple of months would say, oh, we love it here, we really, really love it here. And they would say, why do you love it so much? And they said, because we spent the last 12 years of our life trying to pass tests, trying to guess what the right answer is in our teacher's head, and we've done nothing creative. This is the first creative things that we've done. So the art school started to think, what would it be like if we designed a school that ran from the age of 4 to the age of 16 that was based on art school? So the beautiful thing about going to art school is that it teaches you how to think, not what to think. And it's designed in such a way that your imagination is really welcomed. So they created a school called the Red House, which is called the Plymouth School of Creative Arts. And they built this new building for the school, and it's designed to be a school that's like an art school. This is when you arrive downstairs. It's like a workshop, but it's a food workshop. You come in and you can learn to cook. And all this is what the classrooms look like in the school. They're like a studio. There's no rows of desks. There's no whiteboard at the front. Teaching like you would in an art school. It's really quite phenomenal. And it really struck me, you know, I do a lot of writing about climate change, and I have to read the science on climate change, and it's always heartbreaking thing to do. Doing the research for this chapter about the state of health of the imagination in our society today was really, really heartbreaking as well. And it really struck me that when we talk about a school model that was designed to make sure that fascism would never happen again, we have created in our mainstream schools, certainly in the UK, the absolute opposite of that. And then we wonder why we're seeing a resurgence of these kind of ideas that we're seeing happening at the moment. You know, it could have been avoided. What if our storytelling was able to bring a positive future to life? Storytelling is one of the things that's fundamentally important to our ability to inspire other people. And this is the guy that I talked about at the beginning, James Mackay at the University of Leeds, who drew those drawings I showed you. Sometimes in Leeds, he goes out into the city, he sets up a big piece of paper on an easel like this, and he just starts to draw what's in front of him. And then as people walk past him, he'll stop them and say, excuse me, how do you think this place could be in the future? And then he adds their ideas into his drawing. And over the day, it evolves. And he said, all you need is a really simple sketch, and people start to give their ideas. You know, people have their dreams. They have their ideas of the future. We need to find the ways and the storytelling to bring that out. These are two researchers at the University of Plymouth, again, near where I live, Jackie Andrade and John May, who developed something called functional imagery training. And functional imagery training is a way of working with people who want to change something in their lives. Maybe they're overweight, maybe they're addicted to something or whatever. They work with them by helping them to create a story, by imagining that the changes have been made in their lives. So imagine you're out running, and really imagine that with all of your senses, because imagination is multisensory. Yeah? It's also about smells and tastes and sounds. What does it sound like and feel like? And what's the experience of being out running? And you can hear the birds, you can feel the sunshine on your skin, you can feel what it's like when you get out of the shower with all of the endorphins running. You build a new story in your mind. They call it creating a new North Star, or creating new memories of the future. I love this term, memories of the future. And what they find is an incredible success rate, that those changes are made and then those changes stick, because it becomes like a new North Star. And if they can do it in that setting, I think with good storytelling, we can also do it around the climate emergency. This guy here is called Per Gronqvist. Herr Gronqvist works for the Swedish government, and his job title is Chief Storyteller. And his job description to bring to life the day-to-day realities of living in a low-carbon future. I mean, what an amazing job! We should all be capable of being chief storytellers of the organizations that we're in. You know, every conversation that we have with anyone about the climate and ecological emergency, we should have the capacity to bring storytelling into that, to describe the kind of future that we're talking about if we did everything that we could possibly do. What if we started asking better questions? What I mean by that is the ability to ask really, really good questions that start with those words, what if? I'm just going to tell my family to stop being quite so noisy just for 1 second, because that's what working from home can be like sometimes. Hold on. The joys of working from home. So sorry, right, where was I? So what if we started asking better questions? I mean, questions that start with the words what if. So so I want to tell you a couple of stories. This is in London, in South London, in Tooting, which is a neighborhood in London which has a really big busy road running through the middle of it. It has nowhere that's like a town square or a village green or place for people to gather. So Transition Town Tooting, who are a really great transition group in that part of London, I found this place, which is a bus turning circle. It's full of buses that sit there all day waiting to be called to go somewhere. And often they just leave their engines running. The air quality is horrible for the people who live in these houses here. And so the transition group organized a day that was called the Tooting Twirl, where they said, what if the bus turning circle was our village green? And they crowdfunded £2,000, and one Saturday they made all the buses go away, and they turned that space into what it would be like if it was a community space, if it was a village green. They even put real grass down on the ground, and they filled that space with colour, with food, with coffee, with music, with carnival, with all the things that it would actually be like if that was the case. And it was just beautiful. I spent all day there from when they set it up to when they took it all down again. And they had their local MP came. There was really reflected the diversity of that neighborhood, the people who were there. I was able to take my shoes and socks off on a hot summer's day and sit with my feet on the green grass of Tooting. It was really magical. And during that day, something really extraordinary happened. The conversations changed. At the beginning of the day, people said, if this was our village green, and by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, people said, when this is our village green. So somewhere deep underneath the tectonic plates of permission started to move and started to change. It was really powerful and beautiful to see, because they held a space where people could do that. And this wall here that we're looking at, this wall of this branch of Primark, which, if there was a competition for the most boring wall in all of London, this would definitely make the top 3, I think. No one ever stops and looks at this wall. Nobody loves this wall. I started to hear conversations where people said, when this is our village green, what are we going to paint on that wall? What story about ourselves will we paint on that wall? So when you make and hold a good what if question, you can really shift people's sense of what might be possible. One of my favorite what if questions that has come through the transition movement is from Liege in Belgium. This is called the Liege Food Belt, or Ceinture Alimentaire, which started in about 7 years ago with the transition group in the city asking, what if in a generation's time the majority of food eaten in Liege came from the land closest to Liege? And it's such a beautiful what if question, because it includes in the question a kind of a vision of things if they were a bit different. It kind of opens up a bit of possibility of looking and seeing things in a different way. And so I went there 7 years ago. They had come up with this question. They were asking, they invited lots of different people to explore this question. Then I came home, and then about 2 years ago, I went back to Liege. And in that time, they've started 25 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros of investment from local people, not from the bank, not from philanthropists, from local people, investing in those co-ops. They have a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, which I had to go and visit. You know, we all have to sacrifices for the revolution. They started a shop in the center of Liege called Les Petits Producteurs, the small producers, where they sold food from the farms around the city. They have an incubator project to support new people to go into farming. They have an arrangement with the municipality to make land available for people who want to start new food businesses. I met the mayor of the city who said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the future of our city. But you can trace it all back to them asking such a good what if question at the beginning. They now have 4 of these shops. By Pascal here at the top, I asked him, who manages the first shop, I said, what's the potential of all of this? He said, I think by the time we have 10 of these shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilize. Beautiful word in French, fragiliser. It doesn't really work in English, but for me, it kind of does, that actually we need to start to fragilize the supermarkets. They didn't do that by demonstrating against capitalism. They did it by building something better. But they started with a really good what if question. And I've loved to see during lockdown, the number of communities and people who inspired by the book have been using what if as their framing for their conversations for what comes next. This is a transition group in Cornwall near where I live, who have been every day for a month, they posted a different what if question. They were beautiful. What if car parks became play parks? What if birdsong drowned out the traffic? What if cyclists were given priority on the roads? I love this one. What if there was a daily imagination lesson? And by the end of putting one of these up for 30 days, on the last day, they just posted this one, which for me was really powerful because they didn't need to even put all of the words what if anymore. People understood, but the image spoke to conviviality and to community and to connection and to the things that bring us real contentment and happiness rather than short-term pleasure. Capitalism can sell us short-term pleasure, and when it does so, it leads to a rise in depression and anxiety and addiction. Capitalism can't sell us the kind of long-term contentment that this picture tries to capture. In Sweden, the Green Party did a series of adverts where they put the words what if over pictures of things already happening. What if we lived in a society where men could take their children for a walk in the forest without feeling guilty that they weren't being busy doing other things? What if our cities were like this and everybody was involved in food production in the cities where we live? And I visited projects like this, and they're This is a project that emerged out of transition in London, where in Camden in London, the Transition Kentish Town and the local Extinction Rebellion group and the Friends of the Earth group worked together with the local council to take over an empty cafe and to turn it into what they called Think and Do. And Think and Do was a kind of community imagination space that ran for about 4 months, run by volunteers, resourced by the council. And for those 4 months, it turned into a what if space. It gathered ideas. It had all different groups coming in through the day, school groups, faith groups, women's groups, coming in through the day and exploring how they'd like the future to be. You know, when you make and hold and well facilitate these spaces, the imagination of people and the future that they want pours out. You can't mediate this through social media, because social media pits everybody against each other and picks up on difference and stops that kind of it focuses on what we disagree with in the short term rather than what we all long for in the long term. And Gil Scott-Heron had the very famous record that he wrote, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." I think the version that we might make for 2021 would be the revolution will be well facilitated. You know, we have to hold spaces like this, kind of what if spaces that are really well facilitated to bring out people's imaginations and people's ideas. And one of the things they did after the Think and Do closed, and it's now looking for somewhere else to go, is that they created a thing called the Camden Future Journal. Their local newspaper is called the Camden New Journal. They took over, they did a big project of gathering stories from the future from schools and a whole lot of different organizations, really from the diversity of the community. And they created two things. They created an online 100-page book of all of these visions called the Camden Future Journal. And then they also created on their local newspaper for one week, there was a wraparound front cover that was made up of all of these stories. So everybody picking up the local newspaper got to read all these different stories from the future. It's absolutely beautiful. So I have two left for you. One is, what if our leaders prioritize the cultivation of imagination? And I have to say, this is maybe the hardest question speaking to you from the UK in 2021, where our leaders seem to have had an imagination surgery and had it surgically removed. This is Barcelona. So what I mean by that question is, what if we elected leaders? Every leader who comes into power always says, we are going to push the national innovation. We're all about innovation. Innovation and imagination are very, very different things. And the way that I like to explain that difference is by talking about pizza. It's kind of easy because everybody understands pizza. Most people like pizza. So innovation with pizza is absolutely the right thing to do, because pizza works. We all understand pizza. Most people love pizza. You can innovate with pizza. You can try different flours, different toppings, different kinds of cheese, whatever. But you don't need to reimagine pizza. That would be ridiculous, because pizza is great and you innovate within it. Neoliberal growth-based economics is not like pizza, because neoliberal growth-based economics is pushing us off a cliff at great speed and is a kind of a collective suicide pact. You can't innovate within that model, because the fundamental model is so self-destructive. We have to reimagine. And so then imagination becomes the quality that we need to create. And how many great ideas that could have got us out of the climate emergency have we lost because we don't create a space and we don't welcome and evoke the imagination? What would it be like if we elected governments who ran on a platform of, make Britain imaginative again? Or wherever, who said that we are going to put creating the best conditions for the collective imagination at the heart of what we do. What would that look like? Well, I think in terms of democracy, it might look a bit like Barcelona, where the municipalist movement who were elected there have created neighborhood assemblies all throughout the city and done a lot of work on inviting that kind of rediscovering of democracy, it becoming a muscle that we all use, as a result of which I think Barcelona is one of the most interesting progressive cities in the world. Maybe we need an economic model which creates the best conditions for the imagination. In Preston, in the north of England, there the municipality have created what has now become called the Preston model, where they say, the role of our economic model is to make sure that money circulates as many times within the economy of this city before it leaves. So we're going to use the hospital, the schools, the universities as what they call anchor institutions, spend their money into the economy of the city to drive a different kind of economy, to enable the creation of new co-ops, producing energy, producing food, whatever. And Preston is a model within which it has created lots of space for people to step in and be much more imaginative. The woman holding the microphone here is called Gabriela Gomez Montt, and she was, until recently, ran an organization within the mayor of Mexico City's administration that was conceived of as a ministry of imagination. That was the concept. That sounds like something from a Harry Potter book, right? The Ministry of Imagination. In Mexico City, they have a Ministry of Imagination, and that ministry, their role is to look after the well-being of the imagination of the city of Mexico City. There should be ministries of imagination everywhere. This is in Bologna, in Italy, where the municipality in Bologna, this was a story I heard 2 weeks before I had to finish writing the book, and how do I find out more about this? In Bologna, what happened was the municipality noticed there was a massive decline in involvement in democracy in the city, and that the bureaucracy of getting anything done was becoming too much. So they started something called the Civic Imagination Office, not a civic participation office, not a civic, engagement office, a civic imagination office. They created 6 laboratories around the city in different places, and those places would run big visioning, open space, creative events. And the brilliant bit is, though, that when people came up with a good idea, the municipality would say, That's a great idea. Okay, how do we make that happen? We can offer this, 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 and this. You can offer that and that. Good, okay, let's make a pact. And in Bologna, in the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts between the municipality and local people, from really small things like new gardens on streets to really big things like turning an office block into a school to train young people as classical musicians. So if you create the right structure, you can really evoke and then support the imagination. This idea of pacts is really important, I think. So my very last what if question for you is almost kind of one that I will leave you with. I'll talk about a bit, but it's something you might think about afterwards. What if all of this came to pass? What I mean by that is, what would it be like to live in a world in which anything felt possible? I've got a copy of the book here. Did I? No, I didn't. Okay. I haven't got that here. So, oh, yes, I have. So, what would it be like to live in a time when we felt like we could do anything and where imagination was really invited and welcomed? How would that actually be? And so I spent a lot of looking around to try and find examples through history of when that actually happened and when people felt like that. And usually that tends to be in spaces that people create as spaces of resistance, spaces that people make as oppositional spaces like Occupy or like Extinction Rebellion. And one of my favorites that I love growing up was reading about Paris in 1968, the student revolutions, which was very explicitly all about imagination. They had slogans like "Be realistic, demand the impossible," "Power to the imagination," "Imagination taking power," "Forget everything you've been taught, start by dreaming," "Desiring reality is great, realizing your desires is even better." And one of my favorites, which was form dream committees. I love the idea of a dream committee. I have no idea what a dream committee is or what it would even do, but I love the idea. And so I read quite a lot of oral histories of people who were in Paris in 1968. And there's a few little quotes that I really like. One of them was somebody said, "Paris was wonderful then. Everyone was talking. Ask anyone in Paris with fond memories of the spring of 1968, and that's what they'll say. People talked. Students on the street found themselves in conversations with teachers and professors for the first time. For the first time in this rigid, formal 19th century society, everyone was talking to everyone. Talk to your neighbor were words written on the wall. It was fantastic, like living on a constant high. Life was beautiful. The weather was lovely. Everything we did immediately belonged to history. All the hierarchies had suddenly dissolved. In that month of talking, you learnt more than in the whole of your 5 years studying, because you could talk to anyone and everyone. It really was another world, a dream world perhaps, but it's what I'll always remember, the need and the right for everyone to speak. So I love that idea that we start to actually live and really imagine that. And the other quote I'm going to leave you with is by a Scottish novelist who said, "Work as if you live in the early days of a better nation." Work as if you live in the early days of a better nation. So this is a little thing that we created in the transition movement that, together with a guy called Rob Shorter, that emerged out of the book, and was our attempt to say, okay, so if we recognize we have an imagination crisis and we need to rebuild the imagination, what do? We call this the Imagination Sundial. And we say that this is just pulls together what we've talked about, that the imagination needs space. The imagination needs place. What I mean by places is places where you go, and after you go home afterwards, you see where you've come from in a very different way. We need pacts, like I talked about in Bologna, and we need practices, and I've talked through what quite a few of those are. And I'll put a link in the chat afterwards where you can download this sundial and read all the little writing around the side, and the article gives a lot more examples. But this was designed as a way that you can take what I've talked about and put it into practice in different scales as organizations in order to help the imagination to really flourish. And that's just lastly to say, that's really what the transition movement has been about for me. The transition movement is about saying, how do we, in the places where we are right now, without waiting for permission, just get started with building a better world? Start to live as if the future that we long for, a post-carbon, more resilient, more fair, more just, more equal, world, let's just start living as if it already exists. And so whether you start small things like planting some trees or helping a local school to grow food, whether you start a co-housing project or something really ambitious like they're doing in Liege, all of those things matter because they give people a taste now in 2021 of what that 2030 would be. People can interact with it and touch it and feel it and talk to it and smell it, and it suddenly doesn't feel quite so remote and alien and strange. So I hope this has been a useful contribution and has maybe sparked some new ideas and different ways of looking for you. And I look forward to any questions or feedback. Just if you want to find out anything else, as I said, all the people that I interviewed in the book, you can find robhopkins.net. It's the blog that I do, and the video I showed you at the beginning, you'll find there as well. There's a lot of stuff on there. Transitionnetwork.org is where you'll find out more about the transition movement. There's all sorts of things on there. And then From What If to What Next is the podcast that I do, where every 2 weeks we explore a different what if question, and usually the ones that are sent in by people who are listening. And do come and join me on that journey. If you enjoy the book and you want to follow those ideas further, then it's a really nice way to do it. So that's me. That's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope that's been useful. I hope everybody's still awake. Looks like some people are. That's great. Yeah, the commune in Paris, which we are now, thank you very much, which we are now celebrating the something or other anniversary of. So over to you now, if there's anything that you want to share or feedback on or ask me or whatever.